the prerequisite chapter from pre-calculus, looking at lesson 6. We're going to look at complex numbers. We're going to look at the standard form of a complex number, what's the difference between a complex number and an imaginary number in this video. In the subsequent videos, we'll look at operations with those. So we're looking at adding and subtracting complex numbers in one video, multiplying complex numbers in another video, and then dividing complex numbers in the last video. So we'll break that up for you. Okay, so let's take a look at complex numbers. And complex numbers, complex numbers is a little bit more complicated than one too many, as this guy was trying to do, but at least he was working at trying to get better. And this is the standard form of a complex number, a plus bi. You have the real part is this value over here, which would be a, or be a is the variable or the general form, standard form. So this would be a real number, a number like 3, a number like 7, -12, any of those real numbers. The bi is the imaginary part. Now the bi is made up of two parts. The b will be a real number, and the imaginary part is just the letter I. I, if you remember from last year, is a way to handle or is equal to the square root of -1. If we multiply the square root of -1 times itself, any radical you remember times itself simplifies to the radicand that's underneath. So if we were to square the I or multiply I times I, we get the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is equal to -1. This is very important to remember. So when you're multiplying and when you're dividing, so this is a very important concept to remember, that I squared is actually equal to -1. All right? All numbers can be written in this form. Okay? Every number you've ever dealt with up until this point, all real numbers can be written in this form where you have a real part plus bi, an imaginary part, and therefore all numbers are complex. And the examples would be like this. If we had 1/3 plus 1/2 I, that's a real number. I'm sorry, it's a complex number. Here, if we're just looking at the number 5, you're saying, hey, the number 5, that doesn't have an imaginary part. Well, if we put plus 0i, we now have a real part, and we now have an imaginary part. 0i doesn't change the value of 5, so this would be the complex form of the number 5, or the standard form, standard complex form of the number 5. -6, we could do the same thing. We could put plus 0i. So you can see it doesn't matter what number you've ever written in the past. If you were simply to add plus 0i onto the end, you would have a complex number. So all numbers are complex numbers. Now, some of these numbers, what would be an imaginary number then? What's the difference between a complex number and an imaginary number? Well, an imaginary number is a complex number that has no real part to it. So remember, standard form was a plus bi. An imaginary number would be a number that doesn't have the real part here to it, or that real part is 0, so it would not need to be written. That would be an imaginary number. So here we have 5 plus 3i. That's complex because it has a real part and it has an imaginary part. 3i is just an imaginary number because it has no real part to it. So this is complex, this is imaginary. So for example, I'll run a few examples by you, see how you do with this. So 3 plus 4i, or -3 plus 4i, is that complex or imaginary? That would be complex because it has a real part and it has an imaginary part. So this would be a complex number. Okay? So let me change utensils here. Let's pick another one here. Is this a complex number or imaginary? This would be imaginary because it has no real part to it. Okay? This number here would be complex or imaginary. This would be complex because it has both a real part and an imaginary part. And one more. Is this complex or imaginary? This would be a complex number because, again, it has both an imaginary part and a real part. Okay, so that's the difference between complex numbers and imaginary numbers, and they really are not that difficult. So that's what a complex number is, that's what an imaginary number is. So that's going to wrap up this video. You can take a look at the next video. Now, how do we add or subtract these complex numbers?